Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to Birkbeck this evening. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. This evening's lecture, as I hope you know, because if you don't know, you've stumbled into the wrong room, will be given by Professor Sander Gilman, who is here from Emory University in the United States. His lecture on circumcision, an index of difference and/or health, is occasioned, in a sense, by the exhibition on blood, which has just concluded running at the Jewish Museum in London, and which was a collaboration between the museum and the Pears Institute. And Sander's lecture is one of a series of lectures that we've had here at the Institute which reflect on that exhibition. Speaking of reflecting on the exhibition, at the end of the evening you will have an opportunity to buy this perfectly formed booklet entitled Blood, Reflections on What Unites and Divides Us, and in it you will be able to read a luminous essay by Sander Gilman and also an essay by me and several other luminous essays. Sander Gilman is one of our most distinguished cultural historians. He's Professor of the Liberal Arts and Sciences as well as Professor of Psychiatry at Emory University. He has a boggling range of research institutes, yes, but also research interests, which range from the history of medicine and the history of psychiatry to the history of Jews and Jewish cultural studies. He is the author of more than 80 books. These include The Cultural History of Obesity and Jewish Self-Hatred, which gives you a sense of the range of his interests. Most recently, he edited Judaism, Christianity and Islam, Collaboration and Conflict in the Age of Diaspora, which I know evidences his great humanity as well as his skill as a historian, his humanity, because he waited for an age very politely for my contribution to the book and still consented to come here this evening. Without further ado, it's really a great pleasure to introduce one of our leading cultural historians, Sander Gilman, to talk on circumcision. Sander.
First of all, let me thank you for coming this evening. Let me preface my remarks with a short summary of my thesis one and a couple of caveats. My thesis is very straightforward. I'm interested in what happens when religious practice is not enough. When cultures have to explain religious practices in ways that make more sense than merely religion. Now, I'm not going to ever do that again, because you look like a demented cricket. I'm assuming that you can catch the subtleties of irony. The major caveat is that I'm going to be talking about male circumcision, primarily infant male circumcision, but I'm going to make reference to what used to be called female circumcision, and it is now called FGM, or female genital mutilation. So there is a kind of a gender bias in this, and you'll see why as we go on. Circumcision defines the Jew. We know this from Genesis. But it's also the case, and it's absolutely one of those interesting phenomenon, that circumcision is in no way Jewish. That is, the Egyptians practice circumcision, and there is an argument that either the Jews borrowed this practice from the Egyptians, or the Egyptians borrowed it from the Jews, or none of the above. Because many cultures circumcise their young men. And the notion of circumcision as ritual practice is part of religious practice. I'm going to say that again. Circumcision is a religious practice. So if asked why you circumcise, right, the correct answer is because Achnaton, Jehovah, whomever said we should. In a sense, very straightforward. Very straightforward. Circumcision, therefore, is not a problem in circumcising societies. You circumcise because you're circumcised. Very straightforward. Circumcision becomes only a problem in non-circumcising societies, or when circumcising societies and non-circumcising societies come in conflict. Thus, when the Romans, right, whose sense of bodily integrity is taken over from the Greeks, thinks about Jewish difference, they think about it in terms of circumcision, male circumcision. So in the Satyricon, Petronius has Cytos say, "Circumcise us that we may appear to be Jews," laughingly. Tacitus, in the history, by the way, Tacitus, no friend of the Jews, observes that the Jews have instituted circumcising the genitals in order to be distinguished by this custom. It is a custom that Tacitus finds base and abominable, persisting due to their depravity. Now, already, therefore, early on, when these circumcising and non-circumcising societies come in conflict, here when Jews come into the diaspora and or the Romans come into Judea, right? Circumcising is seen as, to use that lovely Old Testament term, an abomination, but an abomination that shows something about the inner life of the people who would do this kind of stuff. Okay? Now, those of you who go on and read about, in a sense, the Jewish response to Roman occupation, as in Maccabees, know that Hellenistic Jews tended, according to 1 Maccabees 15, to remove the marks of circumcision and abandon the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. You may have caught on very quickly that this is kind of what Tacitus later, obviously, says about the Jews. In other words, it has to do with inner character. If you don't circumcise in this situation, you are evil. Right? Now, what comes out of this is this first moment of the interaction between circumcision and medicine. And these are these moments that fascinate me, these moments where all of a sudden circumcision becomes no longer part of religious practice for good or for ill, but now medical practice. And I'm going to have a little bit of a caveat here, because when I talk about this in terms of medical practice, I'm talking about ritual circumcision, not medical circumcision. Right? There are certain genital abnormalities, specifically one called phimosis, which is a tightening of the foreskin, which doesn't allow the infant to expel urine, for which there's always been, or very early on has been, forms of medical circumcision. Here I'm talking about ritual circumcision. And what's really interesting is that one of the early surgeons, whom we have good records, Celsus, develops what I've called the first aesthetic surgery. And he develops a means of reconstructing the foreskin. So, you're Greek, you meet the Jews circumcise, Jews become Hellenized, they want to speak Greek, they want to be part of the big world, they're still Jews. But their bodies are imperfect because they are circumcised, and therefore Celsus develops a means of reconstructing the foreskin. How do you respond to this? Well, we have this first moment of this interaction in Philo of Alexandria. Philo is in a very strongly Hellenistic culture, where, according to the historian Josephus, in his Against Appian, Appian had derided the practice of circumcision. No big surprise, right? This notion of circumcision, the Greeks in general thought was just an abomination. Philo advocated for circumcision. Now, he didn't, and this is really important, he didn't advocate for circumcision because God said you should circumcise so that you become part of the Jewish people. He noted, and this is the first time that this is done, though there is a reading of Herodotus's account of Egyptian circumcision, which tends to show that the Greeks already are doing this looking at Egyptian circumcision. Philo notes that circumcision was a prophylaxis against diseases of the penis. To quote Philo, it was preventative of a painful disease and of an affliction difficult to be cured, which they called a carbuncle. And it also promoted the well-being of the individual and assured fertility. Circumcision may be a Jewish ritual that alters the body, but it is also, and with Philo, there's no question about this, is a health advantage. Now, this is an answer to the notion that circumcision is an abomination, that it shows the evil intent of the Jews, that it shows something about their character. And the answer is no, we don't need to have our foreskins reconstructed through medicine, because this act of circumcision itself is a type of medical intervention. And what does it do? And it's really interesting. Again, specifics like the carbuncle, but, and this is really important, it assures the well-being of the individual and assures fertility. Very strong arguments about notions of the interiority. Herodotus, as I've noted, writes about the Egyptians and those that learned circumcision from them. He talks about this in general, that they practiced circumcision for the sake of purity, considering it better to be pure than comely. And the big question is what he means by pure. Right? That's not a term that we see in any of the Egyptian papyri that have to do with circumcision. It's a Greek reading. Right? Does it mean healthy? Maybe. Now, there are four views of the problem of circumcision in modernity. And they're in connection, obviously, with the Jews, because from the rise of Christianity on, as you've noticed, it's even pre-Christian, circumcision defines the Jew. And I'll remind you that there is a gender bias here. The Jewish male, all right? Paul first saw circumcision as inherently symbolic and therefore no longer valid after the rise of Christianity. It was a Noahide law pertaining only to the Jews. And this is the thing that Paul does. Paul says, hey, look, there are big laws that we have to follow, and then there are the ones which the coming of Jesus, in a sense, has suspended. This view was espoused by the church fathers, Eusebius and Origen. It continues through the Renaissance. Erasmus argues this, and through the Reformation, Luther does. It forms the theological basis for the distinction which Christians were able to make between their body and that body of abominations, which is the body of the Jews. And this becomes part and parcel of a modern discourse about circumcision. Kant, in his 1793 essay on religion within the boundaries of mere reason, notes The subsequent discarding of the corporeal sign which served wholly to separate these people from others is itself warrant for the judgment that the new faith, Christianity, not bound to the statute of the old, nor indeed to any statute at all, was to contain a religion valid for the whole world. And it had to be for the whole world, because the Greeks, Paul knew, would never accept circumcision, and not for one single people. It's a Jewish practice. What gets raised then is, what is the function of circumcision among the Jews? Spinoza in the Tractatus 1670 notes that the sign of circumcision is, as I think, so important that I could persuade myself that it alone would preserve the nation forever. In other words, it's a sign of a political or group identity. And liberals, like my favorite 19th century Italian physician, Paolo Mantegazza. Mantegazza is my hero. He emigrated to Argentina as a young physician and brought cocaine back to Europe. And he wrote a series of sort of standard ethnological sources on human sexuality, which were oftentimes given to young women on their wedding night, as if they're going to read these books on their wedding night. He notes that circumcision is a mark of racial distinction. It is a sanguinary protest against universal brotherhood. And if it be true that Christ was circumcised, it is likewise true that he protested on the cross against any symbol which would tend to part men asunder. This is a liberal arguing, right? In other words, Spinoza says it's what identifies the groups as a collective, and it's what Mantegazza says is what identifies the Jews as a collective. You can take it pro, you can take it contra. The third reading of circumcision, certainly from the Enlightenment on, is one which, again, fascinates me to no end, because it is a notion that there's a kind of atavistic quality of circumcision, that it's a remnant of early Jewish idol or phallus worship, or a substitute for child sacrifice. The professor of anatomy, physiology, surgery, and obstetrics, J.H.F. Autenrieth, saw circumcision as a primitive act practiced by culturally inferior peoples such as Jews and African blacks. Autenrieth, by 1829, the chancellor of the University of Tübingen, entered the discussion of the meaning of circumcision with a public lecture on its history. For him, as for many others, circumcision was a surrogate for human sacrifice. Think about the blood libel, right? This is the blood libel written into circumcision. Just about 25 years before the reappearance of the Damascus blood libel. It's all the same thing. John Lubbock, the anthropologist in 1870, saw the rite of sacrifice as a stage through which, in any natural process of development, religion must pass. But the Jews also sacrificed their animals at temples as symbols of human sacrifice, which at one time were habitual among the Jews. Under the rubric, it's better to cut up your foreskin than to kill your kids, which is probably even true, right? It's probably even true. But it says something about what? The inner nature of the Jews. Right? We started with that, which is that the Greeks say, hey, look, this is not a good people if they're going to do this kind of stuff. The fourth reading, and this is the one that I've obviously begun to talk about, and I want to talk about in substantial detail today, is that circumcision is a form of medical prophylaxis. It's what I'm going to call the positive health exception, the other side of Celsus, in other words. Philo seems to be the first person who's written about it. He claims that it was a prophylaxis against the diseases of the penis, but as you'll remember, it promoted the well-being of the individual and assured fertility. And it reappears in society where circumcision is contested as a practice, as an attack on circumcision, and as a defense of circumcision. William Osler, the great Canadian surgeon, founder of Johns Hopkins University, professor of surgery at Oxford University, notes in 1914, we may go to Moses for instructions in some of the best methods of hygiene. Now, we're now starting to move into an interesting moment, because by the, can we say, the middle of the 19th century, we can make an argument, and this is a commonplace. I mean, this really is almost a truism that is so true that is really not true, is that religion begins to give way to science. All of the power that religion had from the earliest, and you can talk about the Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, Christianity, and so forth and so on, begins to give up its power to science. This is what's always talked about in terms of Darwin, for example. But it's also true that by the end of the 19th century, the debates around circumcision are no longer debates about human sacrifice. They're no longer debates about political and religious identity. They tend to be, in defenses of circumcision, arguments about prophylaxis, about the fact that circumcision is a form of health. Circumcision becomes a hot topic in the latter half of the 19th century. As an anonymous author stated in the leading German pediatric journal in 1872, the circumcision of Jewish children has been widely discussed in the medical press, very widely discussed in the medical press, as is warranted with topics of such importance, but it is usually discussed without the necessary attention to details and the neutrality that it deserves. Indeed, it has not been free of fanatic anti-Semitism. Or you might add, if you think about the prophylaxis argument, fanatic pro-circumcision. That is, it becomes ideology rather than science. The anti-circumcision people are certainly present. In the greatest handbook of surgery of mid-19th century, in Diefenbach's Die Operative Chirurgie of 1845, Diefenbach describes the fact that Jews in Central Europe, in the German states, are still having again, decircumcision procedures. That is, they want to look like their neighbors. But he tells us, unlike Celsus, what this implies in his world, the world of the non-Jewish surgeon. Must understand me correctly, he writes in his handbook. I present such methods, the Celsus decircumcision operation, only for their physiological surgical principles, and to illustrate Celsus' idea of the extension of the prepus, the reconstruction of the prepus, out of luxury, belief, shame, or politics. And this is a gorgeous passage. It would be a denigration of the art of surgery if in this manner bachelors are created like virgins through the reconstitution of the hymen, about which one writer so pointedly said, a fine operation. Both are a morbid mockery of humanity from the practice of the Oriental slave trader. If you decircumcise a Jewish male, he's no longer identifiable as Jewish. And he's just like the deflowered virgin whose hymen has been reconstructed. By the way, a cosmetic procedure which is one of the most frequent ones now practiced in contemporary London. As many of you know, just about this time with Diefenbach, this discussion about circumcision in the German states becomes part of the program of the Society for the Friends of Reform. This is a group of Jewish intellectuals, for the most part, who are trying to rethink Jewish ritual practice, right, in terms of modernity and the rise of science. They made an argument that circumcision, the Brit Milah, was neither a religious obligation nor a symbolic act. So much with Autenreit, so much with Paul. This was in response, by the way, to a very specific moment, and one which really interests me. Because on February the 8th, 1843, the Frankfurt Public Health Authority had found that circumcision had to be carried out under medical supervision. That is, if you're going to do an operation, it has to be done by docs. This is pre-Lister. Right? This is pre-Lister. It's also, by the way, pre-anesthesia. With the expanding role of medicine came further opposition. Certain aspects of Jewish ritual circumcision, such as the mitzitza, the drawing of blood from the circumcision wound through sucking, were deemed unhygienic. Outbreaks of syphilis and tuberculosis from 1805 to 1865 were blamed on ritual circumcisers. Many reformers advocated mitzitza to be done using a sponge or a glass tube. Now, what is interesting is that unlike many other ritual practices, slaughter of animals ritually, for example, reform doesn't, in a sense, ban and outlaw circumcision. It becomes a kind of individual choice. But having worked, by the way, in the circumcision records from the 1860s to the 1890s in Vienna, I can tell you that acculturated Jews undertook circumcision in fewer and fewer cases toward the end of the 19th century. And then something happens. Remember, in the background is all this notion that circumcision is some kind of a prophylaxis against, and then the blank is there. I mean, carbuncles, according to Philo. What happens in the course of the 19th century is that an obsession, I really mean an obsession, with a specific form of sexual disease, the disease of resulting from masturbation, a disease which had been first described, by the way, in 1700, becomes a central concern of Western medicine. And they were looking for interventions to stop young boys masturbating. Because as we all know, if young boys masturbate, they all go bald. And their eyesight goes. True. Dr. Fowler, from the East End of London, writes in The Lancet, 1860, has the operation of circumcision any effect on diminishing the habit or practice of masturbation, of onanism, among the male children and the young lads of the Jewish community? Practicing in a neighborhood where this community abounds, I do not remember ever having had either a confessed or even a suspected case of this description amongst our Hebrew brothers. I wish I could say the same respecting juvenile Christians. Circumcision is a prophylaxis. Again, theology gives way to science, and now science is taking on circumcision not merely as a kind of negative response, the surgical reconstruction of the foreskin, but also now as prophylaxis against a wider range of diseases. In Ireland, by the way, I picked these almost out at random. These debates are ongoing in every country in Western Europe and North America. This is Ireland in 1920. And I want you to note the names of the protagonists. Dr. Solomons notes in this debate that most educated people asked to have their sons circumcised. By the way, the royal family by 1920. It helps in preventing masturbation. Circumcision is advised as a real help to the weakest spot in the human character, which is also probably true. The ordinary schoolboy was not taught to keep himself clean. No anesthesia was necessary for circumcision. In fact, it was harmful. And syphilis, and this is one of those moments, and again, this is not just Dr. Solomon's in 1920 in Dublin. This is now a commonplace. Syphilis is 5 times greater in the uncircumcised. Hastings Tweedy, the president of the section of obstetrics of the Royal Academy of Medicine in Ireland, notes that it does not really reduce sexual desire. He doubted Solomon's figures about the prophylaxis against syphilis, and he had seen fatal cases, 3 from chloroform and 1 from hemorrhage. A real debate Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? What is it a prophylaxis for? And what are its dangers? Now, by the mid-20th century, 1900s, something very weird happens. The United States, North America, Canada too, has by 1950 become a majority circumcising culture. Majority of infant males are circumcised, over 50%. Britain, much less. Germany, even less. Now, what happens in a circumcising culture such as the United States, where there is a basic opposition to the practice? And what happens is a rather interesting one. It has to do then with infant human rights versus notions of communitarianism. In other words, infants now have rights not to be circumcised, even though the community may demand it for group identification. Spinoza. Again and again, as in this article in 1987, circumcision is attacked as the rape of the phallus. The focus is on infant pain and bodily integrity, which, by the way, Diefenbach would have been happy with, Celsus would have been happy with, from the perspective of the best interest of the child. This is Anna Freud. This is now a commonplace about how we deal with infants. No argument in the 1980s in arguing against circumcision was made about a positive health exception, only the assumption of a negative one. The UK is a rather interesting case. Because as I said, circumcision is becoming, if not commonplace, it's becoming more commonplace among what we used to call the upper classes. But in 1949, newborn circumcision was dropped from the NHS in response to Douglas Gardner, who was one of the creators of the NHS, who was opposed to it, noting 16 deaths annually, though he doesn't note that these were usually from general anesthetics, which were employed, not local anesthetics, and not the circumcision itself. In England, the rate at age 15 was reported in 1989 at 7%, and it reduces itself, by the way, after mid-century, both in the United States, in Germany, and in the UK. Now, up to this point, the Jews have been the target. But something very interesting happens. And I said I was going to raise this question of FGM, of female circumcision, to use an older term, which is that the Jews, by the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, are in a sense now well integrated into society. Their circumcision practice is, if not tolerated, ignored. But what is the target? The target, of course, are Muslims. Muslims from South Asia in the UK, Muslims from Turkey in Germany, Muslims from both the former Dutch colonies as well as Africa. And there is a moment, which is a very interesting moment, many of you may remember it, at the Year of the Woman in Nairobi, where Western women stand up and invite against female genital mutilation. And local women in Africa say, hey, white woman, what are you doing talking about our black bodies? But FGM becomes a kind of liberal code, becomes bad in and of itself. And the difficulty with that is that, as we used to say, if you say A, you're almost required to say B. One of the great figures, still is, of anti-Muslim rhetoric, now in the United States, at that point in Holland, was Hirsi Ali, the Somali, at that point, member of parliament, who comes out, of course, against female genital mutilation. It's central to her case. She is herself mutilated. But she makes the obvious argument that if you're going to be against female genital mutilation, you've also got to be against, can I use the analogy? Male genital mutilation. It's 2004, Rotterdam. Up to that point, the Jewish community in Holland is very cool with Herzi Ali, because they aren't terribly hot about Muslims either. They have become Dutch, circumcising or not circumcising. But all of a sudden, what was a good liberal front against backward religious practices flips back in the face of the Jewish community. And it took Herzi Ali exactly 4 weeks to withdraw her opposition to infant male circumcision. Because it wasn't good about making allies. It wasn't good about making allies. Muslims have become the litmus test for bad communitarian practices, much as the Jews had from the Enlightenment on. Concerns in the UK were raised about community circumcision and inequality of healthcare provision in the UK, noting the commitment by Scotland, at least to a funded ritual circumcision service within the hospital-based setting. And by the way, it was very interesting when people were talking about, as they probably will if Britain leaves the EU, Scotland becoming independent. One of the big qualities that the Scots were kept on saying against the English was that we have much better health care. I found it interesting they didn't mention the fact that they pay for ritual circumcision, which of course is not paid for here in England. Islam comes into the courts. 1999, the first of the major cases. In the case Re J, concerning a child's religious upbringing, circumcision in Britain required the consent of all those with parental responsibility or the permission of the court acting, and again, Anna Freud is always present, in the best interests of the child, and it issued an order prohibiting the circumcision of a male child of a non-practicing Muslim father and a non-practicing Christian mother with custody. The reasoning including evidence that circumcision carried some medical risk, that the operation would be likely to weaken the relationship of the child with his mother, who strongly objected to circumcision without medical necessity, that the child may be the subject to ridicule by his peers as the odd one out. And here we start to get this interesting medicalization of this, and that the operation might irreversibly reduce sexual pleasure. And by the way, if you know the rhetoric about FGM, about female genital mutilation, that's central to it. By permanently removing some sensory nerves, even though cosmetic foreskin restoration might be possible. Celsus Diefenbach is always in the background. California, 2011. A proposal is made in the city of San Francisco that would make it unlawful to circumcise, excise, cut, or mutilate the whole or any part of the foreskin, testicles of penis of anyone 17 years young or younger in the city of San Francisco. This becomes an enormous cause de célèbre, which again fascinates me because it brings two communities that because of the Israel-Palestine conflicts have not always seen eye to eye, which is the Jewish and the Muslim communities on the West Coast. David Wolpe, who is probably the best known rabbi in Los Angeles, a real political figure, noted that some involved are simply opposed to religion. In other words, this is anti-Semitism. There are after all, some misguided Jews arguing for the ban as well. Some wish to target both Muslims and Jews. But can anyone doubt that there are anti-circumcision advocates who seize on this as a chance to hurt Jews and the Jewish tradition. The anti-circumcision people publish a comic, an illustrated magazine called Foreskin Man. Probably not the wisest thing they ever did. Kind of plays into the anti-Semitic notion. But it was interesting that all religious groups suddenly saw this as an attack on religion. Jews, Muslims, and Christians all trace our spiritual heritage back to Abraham. Biblical circumcision begins with Abraham. No American government should restrict this historic tradition. Essential religious liberties are at stake. The proposed ban violates the First Amendment's guarantee to exercise one's religious belief. This is a Christian organization of evangelicals who are Pauline in everything they do, but are in favor of making sure that Jews and Muslims can circumcise. October 2011, the governor of California, Jerry Brown, signs a bill into law that prevents California communities from banning the practice of circumcision on infant males. There is a law on the books in California banning female genital mutilation. Never any discussion of that. Anti-circumcision measures would infringe on the medical, religion, and personal freedoms of parents, the law argues. In Germany, 2012, the German equivalent organization, pediatric organization, had stated its opposition to infant male circumcision and thus came to support a German court ruling banning the procedure as violating the bodily integrity of the infant as well as putting the infant's health at risk. This has to do with Islam in Germany. According to the decision handed down by the Cologne Regional Court, circumcision of young boys is a criminal act prohibited by law, even if the parents have consented to the procedure. This is a case of a 4-year-old Muslim boy whose circumcision was performed by a doctor. There were complications. The child was brought into the emergency room. The emergency room doctor called the police. The response to this court case on the part of Jews in Germany, right, was that circumcision is absolutely elementary for every Jew. The president of the Organization of Jews in Germany, Dieter Gaumann, the then president, noted. He warned that if the Cologne ruling were to become the legal basis, Jewish life in Germany might ultimately no longer be possible. And again, the rhetoric of this is quite fascinating to me. There's a conference of European rabbis, an emergency meeting. The chief rabbi of Moscow, Pinchas Goldschmidt, calls the Cologne ruling the worst attack on Jewish life since the Holocaust. Now, what's interesting is that this is seen as a kind of part and parcel, and by the way, it may well be, I'm not arguing that it isn't, of a kind of general anti-Islamic feeling, the banning of the veil, Switzerland's banning of the construction of minarets, and it's a sign of intolerance. Now, we know that this is this argument about secularization. What is it that you have to give up to become part of secular society? Certainly, in the late 19th century, many Jews gave up infant male circumcision. But what's interesting is that the Cologne courts, right, made a distinction between ritual circumcision and medical circumcision. And this is one of those things that interests me because they never define medical circumcision. It becomes a kind of an out. The German law is changed, right? It's changed. And the new paragraph 1631 of the Basic Law notes that children may be circumcised. There are certain caveats. There has to be medical supervision and so forth and so on. But you may not ask about the motivation of the parents. Wonderful out. Is it medical? Is it ritual? You can't ask that. You can't ask that. You can just, children can be, circumcised. No question about why. Now, let me argue that something else is happening at exactly the same time. Starting under George Bush, whom some of you remember was President of the United States for 8 extremely long years. The Centers for Disease Control Center for Dealing with AIDS, which was called PEPFAR, had undertaken a whole series of interventions, starting actually under Clinton and then expanded under Bush. Bush forbade the advocacy of any type of prophylaxis, any type of use of condoms, because the church, the Catholic Church, and by the way, many Protestant churches, were against the use of condoms. As a result, there was a pilot project undertaken in East Africa by the CDC, which looked at whether or not male circumcision, looking at adult male circumcision, but also potentially infant male circumcision, might reduce HIV/AIDS in the population. The finding of the CDC was that yes, it did. Because in point of fact, they had to spend their money. And they spent their money advocating for circumcision. But the question then was, and this is 2008, if it's going to be advocated for in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, why not advocate it in the United States? And the CDC was very quiet about that. They had a potential approach which would have advocated for infant male circumcision for prophylactic reasons, but they never advocated for it in the U.S. And that dichotomy had to be explained. And the first explanation was, well, sex in Africa is rougher than sex in the United States. Yeah, right. It's a different kind of HIV infection. Yeah, it is technically, but it's still an HIV infection. So there's a big debate. In other words, if in point of fact you're going to advocate it for sub-Saharan Africa as a prophylaxis, now against HIV infection, as against masturbation in the 19th century, you've got to be in or out. The debates were raised also whether or not the efficacy of circumcision, right, was in point of fact as great as stated. And there are a number of papers, and I'll just point to the Boyle and Hill paper from 2011, which notes that the benefit has been really overstated. And one of the difficulty is that you can't easily do controlled studies of this. You're basically looking at people whom you've persuaded, usually for some type of remuneration, to allow themselves to be circumcised, mainly as adults. In 2012, the American Academy of Pediatrics reversed its stand on infant male circumcision. Their earlier position had been neutral. Now, in 2012, they argued that scientific evidence shows that the health benefits outweigh the risks, and the benefits include, surprise, surprise, lower risks of acquiring HIV, genital herpes, HPV, human papilloma virus, and syphilis. May reduce in sexual partners, reduction of cervical cancer, and lowers the risk of urinary tract infections in the first year of life. Now, the difficulty is that this is an argument from within a circumcising society. The United States, 21st century, even though a reduction has been a reduction in circumcision, is still very much a circumcising society. In pediatrics, a group of pediatricians not based in the United States looked at the claims and argued that only one of the arguments put forth by the American Academy of Pediatrics has some theoretical relevance in relation to infant male circumcision, namely the possible protection against urinary tract infections in infant boys, which can easily be treated with antibiotics without tissue loss. So, European pediatric surgeons, for the most part, and pediatric specialists, argue that the advocacy of circumcision for medical reasons. Now, you see how far we've come from notions of ritual. Right? We're arguing now purely that blanket infant male circumcision for medical reasons is, in point of fact, something which is uncalled for, as opposed to in the United States, because these are cultures that are non-circumcising societies, and therefore they don't believe that it has that health effect, as opposed to the circumcising society, which does believe it has that effect. The American Association of Pediatrics dithers Susan Brawley and Sarah Stratford here in London argued between envisioning neonatal circumcision as a benefit and cannot have it both ways. Either infant male circumcision is better for health and thus is a therapeutic indication for all, or it isn't. It has to be classified as cultural, religious, habitual, cosmetic, or mutilation. If it is not beneficial or risky or harmful, then society can either allow some leeway for parents to harm their infants with or without medical collusion, or disallow it until boys are of an age to make their own decisions. This is the human rights argument. Okay, now, I see some of you saying, well, that makes sense, except, of course, we vaccinate infants. We vaccinate infants. I don't think my 2-year-old granddaughter was ever asked whether she wanted to be vaccinated. I can assure you, had she been asked, I know what her answer would have been. Right? In other words, then this is a really interesting question. That is, at what point do we think about inalienable rights? Right speak has its own downside. And what point do we think about medical prophylaxis? 2014, the CDC comes out of the closet. And this was so shocking. I mean, completely shocking. My university and the CDC are joined sort of at the hip. We share the same campus. So I deal with the people in STIs and have dealt with them now I've been in Emory for 12 years, so for 12 years. And they finally came out of the closet, and they simply said, other considerations such as religion, societal norms, and social customs, hygienes, aesthetic preference, and ethical considerations influence decisions about male circumcision. Ultimately, whether to circumcise a male neonate is a decision made by parents or guardians on behalf of their newborn sons. When desired by parents, and here again, we're really interested in this, parents and guardians, medically attended neonate medical circumcision should be performed by trained practitioners, not necessarily physicians, according to accepted standards of clinical care with appropriate use of analgesia. Now, those of you who have a long memory, remember Frankfurt in the 1840s and the idea that circumcision spreads disease through a practice called Metziza. The mohel, the circumciser, orally sucks blood from the wound following the incision of the foreskin. The mouth is full of wine. And in New York, all of a sudden, among the ultra-Orthodox, this is a procedure which really is only among the ultra-Orthodox in New York, there is an outbreak of herpes. And the local health department wants to notify parents of the risk. Children have been infected. One child we know died. And remember, there's this kind of long tradition, especially in New York City, of attributing the transmission of STIs to ritual circumcision, true or not. And so the Orthodox community is very, very, very anxious about it. 2012, the New York Board of Health passed a regulation that will require consent from parents. The risk of contracting herpes is about 1 out of 4,000, which isn't high, but high enough. Some members of the panel that discussed this argued that the getting just consent, that is giving the parents a piece of paper which says, I know that there's a risk. You sign it, you can do it. Joel Foreman, who is a professor of pediatrics at Mount Sinai, notes that we are crazy to allow this to go on. And it goes on and on. There's an argument from the ultra-Orthodox community that the city is lying and slandering compassionate rabbis. People feel that if their sons do not have this procedure, he is not Jewish, the mitzitza, so to them this is the most important act that they can do for their son in life. Medically, I don't approve of it, Kenneth Glassberg said, but are you asking me, does it cause harm? It doesn't. I haven't seen enough proof that it does cause harm. 2012, the mayor of New York is Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg has two things going for him. One, he's got all the money in the universe, and two, he's Jewish. By 2015, there's a new mayor. De Blasio is elected mayor of New York with ultra-Orthodox support, and one of his campaign promises is to end the use of the consent form, which nobody ever signed anyhow. Right? The city of New York now has stopped requiring moles to obtain consent. Moles say that by using correct infection control practices, such as gargling with mouthwash, which is, by the way, as ludicrous an argument as you can possibly make. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the history of mouthwash in this group, by the way. They can spread prevent the spread of the disease. They believe that many neonatal herpes cases the city attributed to moles were caused by a family member or a caregiver touching the circumcision wound with a finger or hand. Right? Now, what's weird about this? Well, one of the interesting problems is diseases don't know what direction they spread in. There's a wonderful article in 2000, and it was well before all of these debates about herpes and ultra-Orthodox forms of circumcision, noted that blood-borne pathogens such as hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, may be transmitted from an asymptomatic but infected neonate to the mole. So the unintended consequences, even if you use mouthwash as a mole, is that you may actually become infected with a whole range of diseases. No one has, by the way, examined the mohalim in New York about the occurrence of these diseases, including, by the way, the commonest of them, which are the hepatitis, forms of hepatitis. Now, the question I want to end with is, why has this debate about circumcision surfaced in the United States, in the UK, and in Germany in different forms? By the way, and also I have hundreds of case studies. We can talk about Sweden if you want, France. I mean, I'm just using these as examples. Certainly has to do with the public debates about Islam recently, about Sharia law. The state of Oklahoma has passed a state law forbidding the use of Sharia law in the state of Oklahoma. And civic society that are fiercely debated in the public sphere in all these countries. From the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams' views of Sharia law in 2008, to regional attempts to outlaw these laws in American states such as Oklahoma with virtually no Muslim community. While in the past it was the ritual practice of circumcision among Jews that was the trigger for such debates, it is now Islam, with the possible exception in New York City. Advocates evoke the health exception, and public health authorities are placed in a position to either support or contradict such claims. Opponents stress the violation of human rights of the infant and note health risks. These ideological claims color the science in all directions, which is, by the way, always true. Medicine is always political. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Doesn't mean it's bad, it doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means that it's part of the debates within, if you pardon the pun, the body politic. These ideological claims color the science in all directions, either blurring risk, making broader claims, or providing rationales for the procedure. This seems in no way impacted by evidence-based medical or epidemiological claims. Now, what is interesting to me in the United States, at least, is that this is analogous to the debates about the health exception in abortion. Abortion is right, if you think about the human rights argument, because women have a legal right to control their bodies unless you are opposed to abortion where the rights of the fetus are trumped. This was written before Donald. Unless, and this has recently been foregrounded in American discussions, the pregnancy is the result of rape, incest, or endangers the health of the mother. That is, even people who are opposed to abortion see that abortion is potentially possible in these cases. The most radical opponents of abortion, such as at this point Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, dismiss the first two exceptions, rape or incest, by the way, misspelled, I apologize for that, incest. But the health exception seems always to remain, even among those most opposed to the procedure. In the modern world, the health exception, argued on both sides of the circumcision debate, can in truth never be resolved. One observer's health risk is another's valid intervention. One observer's sense of the rights of any category may or may not be trumped by a health risk. Circumcision, then, is an interesting case, because it's a case, certainly over the last 200 years, which is fraught with how one thinks about ritual practice in a secular, and one has to understand secular meaning also science-based society. I'm going to leave it at that point and open it then to questions and rebuttal. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sander. As Sander said, we have time for questions and discussion. We have a roving mic as well. So if you put your hand in the air, I'll ask Jan to deliver the mic.
But just your hand.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I have a bit of a cold. Thank you for your fascinating talk. I've got two questions, but I think I can combine them as one, which is about why certain practices remain. It's starting with tzitza, as I understand it, in the same place in the Talmud where this is ordained. There is also the instruction to apply cumin to the wound.
Yeah.
But I understand that has actually died out.
That has died out.
Why is sucking the wound by mouth? Why does that then persist?
Okay, I'll give you the answer of the rabbis. In New York, in the last few years, it's because God told us to do it this way.
But God presumably also told.
Yeah, but you see, you're asking religion to be consistent. Religion. By the way, you're asking medicine to be consistent. These have to do with belief and belief practices, right? What is so fascinating to me is that in response to Frankfurt, what happened among the reforming congregations that maintained circumcision was it became medicalized. They introduced the glass tube. They developed modern circumcision knives. I mean, because the scalpel was something that was really evolving in the course of the 19th century. And you can actually take a look at the history of circumcision implements in Central Europe. Right? In other words, it becomes medicalized. When anesthesia is introduced, anesthesia is used, by the way, oftentimes to the detriment of the infant. You know, general anesthesia is something you don't want to use for neonates. It ain't a good thing. So the answer is because that's the way it is. And if you're asking for rational, clear reasons why X is done and Y is not done, you're not looking at human society. I'm sorry, that's as good an answer as I can give you, which is because.
Well, the second part of the question is the wider question, which is for liberal progressive Jews, for secular Jews, there is no imperative that they must perform circumcision. Liberal Judaism in this country says that it's ultimately the decision of the parents.
Parents.
And they will accept people. And yet, people still carry it out, even secular Jews who may be atheists.
Good.
And I wonder if you have a view on why
I can actually give you a real answer because there have been really good surveys. If you do a survey and ask parents, and it's been done, I mean, we have very good data on this. If you ask parents why they are circumcising their child, if they don't give you a religious reason, right, because we're Orthodox Jews and God, God told Moses and so forth and so on, right? The answer is to look like daddy. Simple as that. Now, circumcision rates have gone down, but the strongest rationale is what we would call aesthetic. Right? Is aesthetic. So you look like daddy. And that strikes me as very interesting because that is a very powerful answer. Right? It has nothing to do with health. It has nothing to do with religious practices. It has to do with aesthetics. Right? So I can give you, that's one where I can give you a very strong answer, where it's not required. By the way, even in homes that are not Jewish, right, that are circumcising because they're in a circumcising society, and because there's been a general sense that this is healthier, if you ask them today, they won't say because it's healthier. They'll say in most cases it's because we want the little boy to look like daddy.
Thank you. There's a question just in front of you, actually.
No.
Sorry.
We have to get some gender balance in this too.
We should.
Comment. I read somewhere that statistically Jewish women are least likely to get cancer of the uterus.
Cervical cancer, yeah, cervical cancer. Also true of nuns, by the way, just in case you're interested. The initial study was actually done in New Orleans by one of my teachers who did health records in cervical cancer among nuns in New Orleans. The answer is that's one of the things that is absolutely seems to be a variable. That is, circumcision tends to men who are circumcised. Let me get the formulation so it doesn't sound too weird. Women who consistently have sex with men who are circumcised. Is that a safe way of saying it? All right? No monogamy there. All right? Tend to have lower rates of circumcision. Of cervical cancer. But the alternatives argument, and we don't have a good study of that, has to do with hygiene practices of uncircumcised men. Right? Hygiene practices. In other words, making sure that one is clean, that one knows how to clean the foreskin. And the irony is, in circumcising societies, we've put less and less emphasis on teaching little boys who are uncircumcised how to keep themselves clean, which is why the European pediatricians are not hot about circumcision, because in Sweden you teach kids, young boys, how to keep themselves clean. And the cervical cancer rates there are analogous to, not identical to, the New Orleans finding, which is that they're lower than in the situation where you have a circumcising society with uncircumcised men and women, right? Was that clear? I'm happy to repeat it. It's, in other words, it has to do for women with the hygiene of the partner, right? And the answer is if you don't have a foreskin, there's a very good chance that you will have, in a sense, better hygiene because there's a very little place for the smegma and the debris to collect. But if you are uncircumcised, you should know how to clean yourself, right?
There are only... Matt.
Thank you very much for your talk. A couple questions. One is, I could see where you're talking about the medical evidence about the health benefits of circumcision are clouded by these ideological assumptions. But are you really saying, A, that there's no difference between female and male circumcision in terms of health benefits? Good. I mean, I went to an FGM thing where they talked about labioplasty as sort of new designer vaginas, but they don't remove the clitoris. So where
Okay.
how do you see the sort of...
Okay, I mean, I thank you for the question because it always comes up. Because I started by saying, you know, all of these societies that we're talking about from the mid 20th century on are opposed to female genital mutilation, FGM. I'm going to use FGM. Is that acceptable? Right? The difficulty is that FGM is a very wide range of practices. It ranges from the removal of the clitoral hood, which is exactly the equivalent to the removal of the foreskin, to total infibulation, the removal of the external genitalia, both the labia minorum and the labia, the sewing together, and the removal of the clitoris, right? That's the one end. The other end is the removal of the clitoral hood. The answer is that it's very clear that any procedure which destroys the genitalia is not a procedure that has anything to do with hygiene. It has only to do with the notion of the diminution of sexual pleasure, right? Which is, of course, one of the attacks on infant male circumcision, including by some of my colleagues at Chicago in the 1990s. But one of the things one has to understand is that this is a really interesting problem about gender imbalance. Among the first generation of reformers in Frankfurt was a very smart man by the name of Leopold Zunz, who was very long-lived. And Zunz came up with a whole notion of gender parities. He said little boys are bar mitzvahed at 13. Little girls should have an equivalent undertaking. Now, that wasn't done in the 19th century. It is now part and parcel of Reform Judaism and so forth and so on. And then he came to the question of infant male circumcision. And he said, if you're going to do infant male circumcision for little boys, what do you have to do for little girls? And this is where, again, I'm really interested in this. There's a very interesting debate that Rabbi Akiba gets involved in about what do you do with little boys who are born without foreskin. That's, by the way, a genital anomaly that's in about one case in about 15,000 little boys born without foreskin. Can't circumcise them, there's no foreskin. And Akiba says you take a single drop of blood. And what Sun said was you take a single drop of blood from the little girls. Now, by the way, we have naming ceremonies. You don't take a single drop of blood. So I was involved with the Somali community when I was at the University of Chicago because the state of Illinois was the first state to pass a law banning female genital mutilation. You went to prison if your daughter was mutilated because the Somalis do infibulation. They do the most destructive form. And one of the arguments we made was if you ban it, as Illinois does, all you do is you drive it underground. And that's exactly what happened. The little girls were shipped back into Somali. This was, again, in the 90s, right, before everything went to hell in that part of the world. And they were mutilated. And so one of the things we tried to talk with the imams about was, what about altering practice? And I used the Akiba, the notion of the single drop of blood, and or the analogy, because they all circumcised their little boys, to removing the clitoral hood. So it was an interesting conversation because banning doesn't get you much. It's true, by the way, here in London, by the way. If you follow this discussion in London, it's exactly the same problem. The minute you ban these procedures, it isn't that they stop, they just get driven underground, right? And so, one of the questions really is, how do you think about these as symmetrical in a world in which gender symmetry is a good thing, not a bad thing? So no, you don't want FGM, but maybe you want some kind of ritual practice if you're going to do infant male circumcision, which is analogous to, even if it's the single drop of blood, right, the single drop of blood, for little girls. It's not a conversation that has an end, by the way. Very few of the imams in Chicago were interested. Right?
There are a number of people who have questions. I'm going to try and gather them up so that everyone has a chance to ask, and then I'll ask Sander to respond before concluding. There's a gentleman over there who had his hand up a long time ago.
Thank you. It really goes back to your point about the founding of the NHS, which then created a new...
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing a word.
When you talked about the coming of socialised medicine
Yes.
to Britain, and
Yeah.
you said at that point that circumcision started falling, and you said because of this guy's report. There's also the question of who pays for it.
Yeah.
And so the question then arises, well, for people who don't have a religious reason for having circumcision, why should the taxpayer pay for something that can't be justified on medical grounds?
Okay.
Thank you.
Whereas in America, I mean, you could point your finger at greedy doctors and say, hey, they've got a self-interest in this.
Thank you. I'm afraid, Jan, there are some questions right at the back. Yes, two in the
And then
In
we'll have to
the
get
last.
three, and then
yes,
I'm not going to retain them all.
surely.
Thank you. Professor Sander mentioned early on about the during the Roman period, early centuries of the Christian era. Now, apparently there was a great deal of competition, fierce competition between the Christian version of Judaism and the rabbinic version of Judaism, that is after the temple was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently the missionary activities of both led to apparently about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire is reported to have been Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Now the traditional rabbinic conversion would have insisted upon circumcision, whereas the church fathers became less and less dogmatic about the traditional Jewish rituals, because they were, of course, proselytizing in a non-Jewish environment. But at the time of Constantine, who was converted to Christianity, the Christian version of Judaism, apparently, according, I think it was Dr. James Park, Reverend Parks, who had a department at Southampton University.
I'm afraid I'm going to hurry you up a little.
Life work was about the relations between Christianity and Judaism, and I think it was there that I read that the church fathers persuaded Constantine to pass an edict that no one could be circumcised whose father had not been circumcised. Now that immediately put a stop to the traditional Jewish conversions and made the path clear for the onset of the development of Christian conversions.
I'm afraid, if you've got a question, could you pose it, please?
The case that it was through this edict of Constantine.
Thank you. And the gentleman next to.
I can answer the last question.
No, just please pose your own question briefly.
There are a number of major differences between distinguishing FGM and MC. There are no long-term consequences with male circumcision, and that, I think, is the most important consideration. The question I'd like to ask you is, opponents of male circumcision are perfectly happy with it, provided the boy consents. Thus you have, for example, the Dutch Medical Association saying that circumcision should be permitted from the age of 18 onwards. Why do opponents of male circumcision not also use baptism?
Thank you.
Okay. Let me start with the last one. There is a substantial literature, and again, I'm neutral on this, which argues that male circumcision inhibits sexual pleasure radically, which goes back to the masturbation argument, and was part of the reading of the second major sexual survey done by the University of Chicago in the 1990s. It's a central argument about the negative impact of long-term impact of male circumcision. Again, I'm not arguing yay or nay. I'm just saying that there are substantial arguments against it from the medical perspective. And to go back to this question, which is a real one, the question with the NHS had nothing to do with voluntary circumcision, non-medical voluntary circumcision, but paying for religious circumcision, which is very interesting. That is, in other words, if you wanted to have your child circumcised in hospital, right, for religious reasons, right, the NHS would not and does not pay for it. And even though there is great pressure for a medicalization of ritual circumcision, right, in Scotland it does. And so that's just a fact of the founding of the NHS. The question of the kind of Pauline Christianity and its impact in the early church, you're absolutely right. There are multiple arguments about whether or not Christianity was seen as a Jewish sect. Paul's view that it was a universal religion. The general problem was that the Roman Empire was inherently anti-circumcision because simply that it accepted Greek notions of the integrity of the body. It's as simple as that. There are no non-Jewish Roman writers advocating for circumcision. Right? It's an interesting moment. In fact, the Roman writers who write about circumcision are surgeons like Celsus, who are advocating for decircumcision, right? So I would agree with you, there are multiple arguments in the first 2-3 centuries after the beginning of Christianity as to what direction, but Paul eventually wins. And he wins in a world in a Hellenistic world, in which circumcision is not seen as a good thing. I mean, that's as simple as a simple fact. That there are all sorts of crossover questions, and that the Egyptians are still circumcising. It's not like we talk about this fixation on the Jews. That's why this shift in Europe in the 1980s interests me. There's a fixation on circumcision on the Jews when there are other peoples circumcising in the Roman Empire, including the Egyptians. Right? Which is very interesting. But when they talk about circumcision, it has to do with diaspora, it has to do with ideas of difference and so forth and so on. 1980s, that's a discussion about Islam, because it has to do with where the tension is and where the anxiety is. And it has to do with the fact that, like it or not, Palestine, which is the Roman rebranding of Judea, is not seen by the Romans as a supportive, nice part of the Roman Empire. Keeps on killing Roman soldiers, right? So I think the politics of that in the Roman Empire is also very interesting. I thank you all for your attention, and go home and don't masturbate.
Before you go home.